Well, my message this morning is on judgment or being judgmental. And when we think of judgment or judging today, I think a lot of us just think of in a courtroom someplace there's a person very imposing in a black robe sitting up above where everyone else is on a bench. And while that's one accurate view of a judge and the act of judging, it's just a small part of a bigger picture. And what I'd like to do today is to look for a few minutes at the concept of judging and how in some cases it can become judgmental. And when we look in the Old Testament, we'll see in various places that God judges. And then we'll see further on that God appoints judges. And then finally we'll see how, in a positive way, we can be expected to do judging in our own time. I'd like to start off with just a little anecdote, a little illustration. And this comes from a time when people, when they took voyages across the ocean, it was rather slow. This was before the day of airplanes. I think it was back in the 1920s, possibly. And let me share this with you. There was a little book of illustrations by a famous pastor, H.A. Ironside, and he pointed out the folly of judging others. And he started to relate an incident in the life of a man who was called Bishop Potter. I guess he was a bishop. I don't know what denomination it was. But anyway, he was sailing for Europe on one of the transatlantic ocean liners back in the days when those things were fashionable. When he went on board, he found that another passenger was to share the cabin with him, the same cabin. And after going to see the accommodation, he came up to the purser's desk in another part of the ship and inquired. He said, "Could I leave my gold watches and other valuables in the ship's safe?" Well, the purser looked at him with a kind of a strange look. And Potter said, "Well, when I went into the cabin, I met my cabin mate, and there was something about him that I was afraid that he might not be a very reliable person." Well, the purser got a sort of a grin on his face. He accepted the responsibility. He took the jewels and the gold watch and everything. And he said, "Well, it's all right, Bishop. I'll be very glad to take these things for you. The other man was up here about a half hour ago, and he said the same thing about you." So that's one example of how judging can happen, being judgmental. So we see in the Old Testament, the Lord judges. And in Deuteronomy chapter 32, 36, and this is chapter that's known as the Song of Moses, Moses is chastising the people for falling away, sacrificing to other gods and worshiping idols. And in verse 36, he says, "For the Lord will vindicate," and in some translations that reads, "The Lord will judge." The Lord will vindicate his people and have compassion on his servants when he sees that their power is gone and there is none remaining, bond or free. And then we can look in Psalm 7, verses 6 through 11, which read, "Arise, O Lord, in your anger. Lift yourself up against the fury of my enemies. Awake for me. You have appointed a judgment. Let the assemblies of the people be gathered over you to return on high." The Lord judges the people. "Judge me, O Lord, according to my righteousness and according to the integrity which is within me. Oh, let the evil of the wicked come to an end, and may you establish the righteous, you who test the minds and hearts. O righteous God, My shield is with God who saves the upright in heart. God is a righteous judge and a God who feels indignation every day. Well, then we can go a little farther in the Old Testament, and we can see that God appoints judges. Sometimes this works out very well, sometimes it doesn't work out too well. We'll see a couple of examples. So in Exodus chapter 18, verses 13 through 16, we see Moses. And the next day Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood around Moses from morning till evening. When Moses' father-in-law saw all he was doing for the people, he said, "What is this you are doing for the people? Why do you sit alone, and all these people stand around you from morning until evening?" And Moses said to his father-in-law, "Oh, because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, they come to me, and I decide between one person and another, and I make them know the statutes of God and his law." Now, as we read further in the passage, Jethro, his father-in-law, expresses concern that Moses is burning out. He's sitting there day after day, from morning till night. All these people are coming one after another. It doesn't seem like there's any kind of a let-up. And his father-in-law, very concerned for him, expresses a feeling that you're going to burn out. You can't keep this. You can't keep this going. You need to delegate authority. And that's a good principle, which is as timely today as it was back in the time of Moses. Now you think for a minute of some of the people you've known over the years, people you've worked with, probably bosses, people in authority, or people who are leaders in a church. And I've known people like this who they seem somehow to want to have a hand on every decision that's made in their organization, from the smallest all to the greatest. And they sort of occupy their time because they can't seem to let go of anything and trust enough people to take over some of these things which could be done. And so they eventually burn out. Well, then there's another passage in Judges where we read about Israel's continued disobedience to God as they were in idol worship. And they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And he gave them over to plunderers. And after seeing that the people were in terrible distress, we read in Judges 2:16, then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the land of those who plundered them. The passage goes on to say, as we read this a little later, that the people didn't listen to the judges. This worked for a while, but they ended up not paying much attention to the judges, and they went back to their old habits of idol worship. And then we look in 1 Samuel, just a verse at the beginning of chapter 8, which says, when Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. And then later we read that the sons took bribes and perverted justice. And basically they were crooks. And when I look at that passage and go farther down and see how evil these people really were and all the damage that they did after Samuel had appointed his sons, I wonder if there's a lesson in there about nepotism. I think sometimes when people in business or in the church or in politics need to fill a position, and the first thing they look toward is somebody in their family, that may or not be the best choice. Maybe there needs to be a little bit wider net spread. So then we can go into the New Testament, and we can consider some aspects of judging. Now, when we move to the New Testament, God has shown us two examples of how judging in the most positive way can set a pattern for us. which if we follow, it'll bring some very positive directions in today's church. Some good lessons for us here. And we consider this passage out of 1 Corinthians for a moment. In 1 Corinthians 6, chapters 1 through 6, when one of you has a grievance against another, does he dare go to law before the unrighteous instead of the saints? Or do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world is to be judged by you, are you incompetent to judge trivial cases? Do you not know that we are to judge angels? How much more, then, matters pertaining to this life? So if you have such cases, why do you lay them before those who have no standing in the church? I say to you, to your shame, can it be that there's not one among you wise enough to settle a dispute between the brothers? But brother goes to law against brother, and that before unbelievers. Now think for a minute, when we think of how the justice system is backed up and how somebody can get into some kind of difficulty and they're sentenced or they're appearing before the court, and weeks and months go by before their case comes up. And you have to wonder how much, in a positive way, the justice system could be thinned out if this principle could be followed. And I also have to speculate today, and I hope I'm not offending anybody here. I don't think I am. I suspect that there might be a fair number of lawyers in our society who would like to skip over this whole part of this passage. They'd lose some employment. Well, the second New Testament example of how we are to judge is in Matthew 18, 15 and 16. And he says, and this passage reads, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. Reading beyond those verses, we can see the possibility, and I think it's more than a possibility. I think it happens more times than we would like, that with the best of intentions, you can go to a brother or sister and go to somebody with whom you have a dispute, and you try to work it out according to the passage that we read and hear that God has set forth for us. And yet that person we're trying to reconcile to may not accept what we're offering. They may listen part way, they may just walk away from you, and you could feel very upset about that. But we can't handle or we can't control how someone else will react to us. Once we have done our part, that's all we can do. And whatever happens with that person is between that person and the Lord. Now, in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, God has shown us how we can go off base in the area of judgment. And we've seen some of that already in that earlier example of Bishop Potter. Where are some things where we see this happening? Now, there could be a whole long list of how judgment becomes judgmental, but I'd just focus on a few examples. The first one is we can judge unwrongly by somebody's actions. We can look at what somebody's doing and we can make some kind of a judgment that really isn't right. And there's this passage in Romans which tell us not to pass judgment on a brother who's weak in faith over minor issues. Now, this is a passage we don't have time to go into the whole part that precedes this, but where somebody can look down on another person because they're eating something that you wouldn't eat, or this someone else has eaten vegetables, and other persons are judging that person because this fellow is just eating vegetables. Well, Romans 14:3 and 4 say, "Let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him." And verse 10, "Why do you pass judgment on your brother? Or you, why do you despise your brother? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God." Now, another way we can judge wrongly and get into judgmentalism is we can get into an indiscriminate fault finding and nitpicking and getting obsessed over small details and becoming upset and critical about them. And there's an example I'd share with you. There was an English pastor whose name was Dr. Parker, and he gave a sermon. He was doing a series of sermons in his church, and at the conclusion of the message, and I hope what I'm about to share with you doesn't happen with me today, but more later, this gentleman came up to the pastor and said, "Pastor, I noticed that you made one grammatical error during your sermon." And Parker looked at him very calmly and said, "And sir, what else did you get out of my message?" And how many churches today and pastors over the years have been damaged by a person in their congregation with a critical spirit? I experienced this type of spirit in a church that I was in many years ago, not this church, I assure you. There was a lady in this church who was very critical of almost anything that the pastor did or said. And it got bad enough that during a meeting one night in a church setting and a special conference, the district superintendent of that denomination knew all about this situation, and he stood up in front of the congregation. This lady to whom I refer was sitting in the back, and he said, I won't mention, I'll call her Helen. He said, "Helen, I would like you to leave this congregation and find fellowship someplace else." She didn't take his advice, unfortunately. She stayed and continued over the years to do some damage, that critical spirit. The other way we can judge people wrongly is based on their physical appearance. Now, we're not really sure in that example about Bishop Potter in the beginning whether the bishop didn't like his cabin mate because of the way he looked. Maybe it was something he said. Maybe it was just some general thing that he didn't like. But we can judge somebody based on their physical appearance. And as I move farther, let me give you two brief examples from real life, and each one starts with somebody looking down on a person because of their appearance. But each one has a positive ending. They each don't start out very well, but they end well. Well, here's a story that I'll share with you. Both of these things, as it happens, were in California. I don't know if that has any main bearing on this. But anyway, we find that there was a teacher named Dodie Gadiant, and she decided that she wanted to take a trip. And she had a kind of a long vacation set up, and she decided to go tour across America. So she had a truck which was pulling an RV, and she was traveling alone in a truck with a camper in tow, and she suddenly, at one point, something was happening. The truck was not running well, and this was on Interstate I-5 near Sacramento in rush hour traffic. It says a water pump blew up on her truck. So she was tired, she was exasperated, she was frightened because she was blocking some traffic. And in spite of everything that she was going through, she was just wishing and hoping that somebody would help her. But everybody just kept driving by. Nothing kept happening positively. And so she was leaning up against her truck, and she prayed, "Please, God, send me an angel, preferably somebody with mechanical experience." Well, in a few minutes, I think 3 or 4 minutes, she heard this roaring sound, and a huge Harley motorcycle was approaching, and a big guy got off the bike. He had long black hair, a long beard, and he had all kinds of tattoos on his arm. Well, he lifted the hood, he looked at the truck for a while, and he figured out what was wrong with it. So he went to work, he glanced at Dodie, and she was looking at him, and I guess she was kind of afraid of him. He was a pretty frightening looking guy with all of the tattoos. And then the thing that really convinced her and made her a little bit more apprehensive, she happened to look at the back of his jacket as he was bending over the hood, and it said, "Hell's Angels, California." Then she really got nervous. Well, anyway, the man flagged down another truck, and fortunately, this guy in the truck stopped, and they worked something out. He hooked a tow strap on. They pulled Dodie's truck. They detached it from the camper, pulled her onto a side street, and he went to work on the truck, and he fixed the water pump, whatever was wrong with it. And so the intimidated school teacher was too dumbfounded to talk, especially after she saw these words, "California, Hell's Angels." So she finally got up the courage to say, "Thank you so much." And they carried on a kind of a strained conversation. I don't think she was very comfortable talking with the guy. So noticing her surprise at the whole ordeal, the fellow looked at her straight in the eye and mumbled, "Don't judge a book by its cover. You may just not know who you're talking to." With that, he jumped on the Harley, started it up, and roared away, and she never found out who it was or anything else, but her truck was fixed, she went on, and everything went out fine after that. Now, I guess several of you know I had a career in college teaching, worked in the colleges for several years, and had the experience over the years of dealing with several college presidents in 2 different colleges. Most of them very good, a couple of them very bad, but that's another story. Well, story about 2 college presidents here. One ends up very sad. One president ended up extremely sad at the end of this. The other one ended up very happy, and we'll tell you how this worked out as I come toward a conclusion. What happened was this. In 1884, a young man died. His name was Leland Jr. I think he was in some kind of an accident. We don't really get the details in the story, but in any event, his parents wanted to do something in his memory. And so they decided they would go to a college and see if they could get a memorial established to him. Well, they went to Harvard University. This is 1884. Charles Eliot was the president of Harvard at that time. And Eliot received this unpretentious couple. I don't think their appearance wasn't like they were very important people. We don't know. They probably were dressed very plainly, but they didn't make a very good impression for some reason on President Eliot of Harvard. And so Eliot apparently was pretty busy with affairs, and he shuffled some papers aside like he was making a great effort to talk to these folks. And he asked what he could do. Well, after the couple expressed the idea that they would like to fund a memorial of some kind, Eliot impatiently said, well, maybe you have a scholarship in mind. Well, the couple said, we were really not thinking so much about a scholarship. We were thinking maybe a building would be more appropriate. Well, Eliot sort of brushed them aside, and he figured that was too expensive. These folks wouldn't have any kind of money to do anything like this. So they went elsewhere. Well, we find out in a minute where they went. About a year after this, Eliot, at his desk at Harvard, was reading an article in a newspaper where a couple had established a $26 million memorial founding Leland Stanford Junior University. And today we know Stanford University. Just think for a minute, folks. 1884, $26 million. Where do you think that would be in today's money? Quite a story, and quite a good ending for one president, and not a very good ending for the other. Well, as I bring this message to a conclusion, let me hear some clear advice from God's Word about how we can and should avoid being judgmental, and indeed how we can show mercy and should show mercy. This is from the letter of James, chapter 2, verses 12 and 13. Now, I didn't go into the leading up to this, but the context, and it's a passage very familiar to folks, that if somebody comes into your church and you don't see that they're dressed very well, you might try to shift them aside and have them sit someplace else and show favoritism to somebody else who's dressed very well. Well, that comes before this. So in verses 12 and 13, it says, "So speak and so act as those who are to be judged under the law of mercy. For judgment is without mercy to one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment." Mercy triumphs over judgment. A very good word. So, in a few moments, we will be continuing our service by celebrating the Lord's Supper. And at this time, I ask Aaron to come forward, and he'll lead us as we remember what the Lord has done for us. Aaron.